Informed consent is arguably the most critical aspect of any clinical trial. In the previous module, we reviewed the ethical and regulatory impacts on informed consent as it relates to clinical research. Now, we will explore the specifics of the process and discuss the 9 key elements that make up any informed consent document. This module will be followed by a brief knowledge check to assess your understanding of the topic. Let's begin. Our learning objectives for this module will be to understand the basics of the informed consent process, to be able to identify the 9 different elements of an informed consent, and then to apply those 9 basic elements to any given research study ICF document. Now, let's get started with a review of the basics. Informed consent is a standardized process that provides participants with all information necessary in order to make an informed and voluntary decision. The information in an ICF must be comprehensible by the receiving party and free of any exculpatory language. Written consent by the participant is required prior to performing any research procedures whatsoever. That ICF must be an institutional review board reviewed and approved document, and within this document will be those 9 key elements to address and discuss with your participant and their audience. So what exactly are these 9 key elements and how do they tie into these 4 main themes? Let's take a look at each of these a bit closer. First, the informed consent form must be IRB approved as previously mentioned, and it is going to be regulated by law, fully explained before any signatures are to be obtained. It is ultimately to aid in the comprehension for the participant, hence the term informed consent. There are 9 key elements that must be identified and explained in each document. First, you must include a description or an overview of the clinical investigation, a statement that makes sure the participant understands that this is research. Secondly, potential risks and/or discomforts to be aware of need to be discussed. Third, an opportunity but no guaranteed for clinical benefit. You must make sure the patient is aware that they cannot be guaranteed clinical benefit, but obviously that the research hopes to help them. Fourth, you must explain and provide any alternative treatment options available to the participant as provided by the physician. Fifth, a confidentiality and HIPAA statement. Sixth, volunteerism and the right to withdrawal. Be sure the participant understands that their signature is not forever and they can withdraw at any time they feel fit. Seventh, cost and compensation. Each trial is going to be different and you want to make sure that the participant has a good understanding of what they may be compensated or charged for participating in the study. Eighth, study contact information, numbers, emails, and address of anyone that the participant may need to reach out to during the course of the trial. And ninth, biospecimen collections and storage. So let's dive into each of these a bit further. The first point you want to hit is a general overview of the research being done. It's important to let the participant know what they may or may not be signing up for, but we also don't want to overwhelm them. It is a lot of information for the participant to take in, so opening up with a clear and concise summary of the trial and its purpose is always a nice way to start off the consent conversation. More specific details can be addressed later on in the consent and through questions that the participant may ask. This statement should include that the study involves research and that this is a clinical investigation of either a product, device, or a method. Therefore, it should briefly outline the study's purpose, participant obligations, expected duration of participation, and any mandatory procedures. The next point of discussion in a consent is something that the participant is likely very eager to hear more about and will likely have many questions on throughout the discussion. The possible side effects or symptoms of whatever drug or device or method the research involves. It's important to be entirely transparent throughout this discussion and do not skip over or leave anything out. Oftentimes, consent forms will list out very extensive lists of possible side effects organized by likeliness of occurrence. You must go through them all, each and every single one, even the rare side effects that might have a very, very slim likelihood of occurring. After hearing these, some patients will become very apprehensive and others will think that this is normal. It's important to recognize that their concerns and answer any questions to the best of your ability. However, do not give answers to questions that you are not certain of. It's okay to tell the participant that might be a good question to ask your physician, and they will appreciate any information that you're able to provide, but we also need to ensure that we are not giving false or misleading answers to any of the participants' questions. Our third element in the consent is a very succinct statement to ensure that the participant is aware they are not guaranteed clinical benefit from participating in the research study. They do need to be reminded that this is research, and while the trial may benefit them in their disease, it cannot be guaranteed for certain. It's always reassuring, however, to throw in a reminder that their participation may benefit future patients and that we really appreciate their time. While, of course, our goal is to enroll participants in clinical trials, it's also very important to remain somewhat neutral and unbiased and not seem too persuasive here. Participants need to be reminded that the treatment on this particular trial is not their only option for treatment, if that is true. Truthfully, this should be a discussion previously had between the participant and their physician, but it won't hurt to remind them to make sure that they do not have any additional questions about other options that we can facilitate back to clinic. We also want to be sure to emphasize that participants have the right to pursue other treatment options without any penalty or loss of benefit within the institution in which they are seeking treatment. In other words, make the participant aware and comfortable with the fact that if they decline the opportunity to participate in trial, their care will not be lessened in any way by the institution. The fifth element of a consent involves a confidentiality and HIPAA statement. As researchers abiding by GCP regulations, we take privacy and the protection of personal health information very, very seriously. We want to make sure that we explain to the patient exactly how their personal health information will be protected and kept confidential throughout the study. We must disclose any personal or organization that may be granted access to the participants' information throughout the course of the study. They should also be reassured that they will be given a de-identification code with any study to be used whenever possible, but that in the potential incident of an FDA audit per se, their information will be exposed for safety review by the inspector. While these audits can be real, they do happen, and it is something that needs to be discussed with the participant. The sixth element of an informed consent is to be sure that the participant understands volunteerism and their right to withdraw from the study. It's absolutely necessary that we make the participant aware that they do have the right to walk away from the study at any time. The participant can sign a consent, get in their car to drive home that same day, and call the research coordinator back immediately, changing their mind and revoking their consent. And that's perfectly fine. They have the right to do this. Participation in the research is completely voluntary, and they are not tied to the study legally in any way. The principal investigator may also choose to withdraw the participant due to noncompliance or adherence to protocol requirements, or if any other better treatment options come along that may benefit the patient clinically. The seventh element of the informed consent regards cost and compensation on trial. Note here that every single trial and research study is different in terms of what they might cost the patient as well as what they might offer as compensation, so this needs to be a very careful discussion and make sure that the participant is fully aware before signing consent. Here we want to discuss cost and compensation with the participants so that they're made aware of what the trial can cost them financially as well as what they might receive in terms of monetary compensation. Note that any compensation for participation on trial is possible, but also be certain not to overcompensate. This will be considered coercion. There must be full disclosure of any additional costs that the participant will be financially responsible for while on study. It's helpful to list all research-related procedures specifically versus what parts of the study may be considered standard of care. Note that all trials provide compensation for injury, but not all studies have funds set aside for this compensation. This will largely depend on the size and resources of the sponsor leading the trial and institutional policy as well. Consenting a participant to a trial can be extremely overwhelming, and they will likely have many questions for you or the investigator. While they do have your individual contact information throughout the study, it's important to be sure they're also provided with a few other resources as well. Who to call about study questions, the PI, or the clinical research coordinator, names, numbers, and email addresses should be provided to the patient. They should also be given numbers and names of who to call about participant rights and injuries, and even someone from the IRB so they can get in touch if they have concerns of how the research is being conducted at the site. ICF templates will have statements and spaces for contact information to be included so nothing is left out. While the final element of the informed consent does not necessarily apply to every research study, it applies to studies with biospecimen collection and storage. In studies that this applies, this needs to be a very careful conversation, as sometimes this is optional, not always required, but the patient still needs to be fully made aware of what they might be signing up for. This final element is to discuss, if applicable to the research study, a brief overview of any biospecimen collections. This can include any research blood draws, biopsy collections, or surgical tissue. Certain research studies require collections at different time points of the protocol calendar. You want to outline with the participant when these will be required for them and clarify which collections are made optional versus which are required per protocol. You also want to discuss any storage or biobanking details with the participant so they are made aware of where their information could or will be stored and for how long. This is an element that may not necessarily apply to every research protocol, but when applicable is necessary to discuss.
Knowledge check. Let's see what you know. Mr. Green, age 23, has come to the ED because of extreme headaches, fever, and drowsiness. The patient's mother brings him in. After ruling out stroke, migraine, and flu, the ED team suspect HIV/AIDS because the medical history taken while the mother was parking the car. The test comes back positive, and a cryptococcal antigen test is also positive. A cryptococcal meningitis study is being conducted at the institution. The ID study nurse is contacted and she arrives at the ED to discuss the study with the patient. The patient is on a gurney in an open bay of the ED. His mother is back, and the study nurse immediately begins the informed consent process. What should have occurred? Select the best answer. The study coordinator introduces herself and begins reading the informed consent to the patient and his mom. B. The study coordinator gives the informed consent to the participant and his mother to read and steps out to get a cup of coffee. C. The study coordinator assesses the situation, provides privacy, and speaks to the patient without his mother to determine if she can be present for the informed consent process. Or D. All of the above. So this is what should have happened. The answer is C. The study coordinator assesses the situation, provides privacy, and speaks to the patient without his mother to determine if she can be present for the informed consent process. So here's how it might go down. The study coordinator draws the curtains and makes sure the patient is comfortable and that there's privacy. She asks the mom to step out and afterwards asks the participant if they understand their diagnosis of HIV and AIDS as an AIDS-defining illness of cryptococcal meningitis. She assesses the patient's mental status, making sure it's okay for the informed consent process, because sometimes meningitis can cause poor mental status. And she asks if the mom can be present, since she's going to be discussing his HIV status and the study for an AIDS-defining illness. Then goes through each of the elements of the informed consent form and determines the patient's comprehension, allowing time for questions. So keep in mind, this is a sensitive situation. The participant is just learning about their HIV diagnosis and is vulnerable because of that. And meningitis can affect mental capacity. HIV status is a privacy issue, and he may not want his mom to know.